Some of you are about to be very happy with what I'm about to tell you. Some of you might not be so happy, but the good news is that you're all still great people, and hopefully you still like me after I say this. So, here's the thing about this paper. This paper is a ton of notes. It's your information on labor unions for this class. We won't be doing anything else on labor unions in the class. This was all on you. Because it is all notes, and I don't want to have to take away your notes from you, we are not going to turn it in today. Which means, if you did not do it, you're lucky, because you're not going to get graded on it. If you did it, it's still okay. Well, did you not do it? Okay, so you're the person who benefits. See, it's a good day for you. On the other side, I'm letting you know right now, though, listen, this is the only information that you're going to be doing it. So if you did not do it, or chose not to do, which a lot of you who are super red right now are those people, is that you still need to be able to do this. Now, for everybody else, the good news is you guys are going to kill the 5 questions that are on this test. A couple years ago, this is a key concept, one single one that's itty-bitty and small, and they had an entire DBQ on it like 5 years ago. So it could be thrown in there, could be not. I think it'd be a terrible DBQ, but who knows? They also did populism one year, and that was awful. So instead, I'm going to tell you the must-know information on this. So if you'll have it out either your highlighters or whatever, I'm going to tell you the information that are must-know information for you. So, starting on the side that is the labor unions. So starting on the labor union side. Okay? So, on your labor union side, what you need to know is if you will star Knights of Labor. Knights of Labor. Now, what you need to know about the Knights of Labor is you need to know that they were the most influential out of all the labor unions. And if you didn't write this, I would write it down. Most influential out of all. You need to know that it had the most membership. And that was mostly because they allowed everybody, skilled and unskilled workers, African Americans, minorities. That made it really big. And while they don't exist nowadays, it's mostly because of controversy. So if you make sure to write down controversy, and if you do controversy / anarchy, which is ANARCHY. Now the reason why, and as you guys research this, you probably saw it during your research, is that a lot of these labor unions, the controversy was whether or not they are dangerous or not. A lot of people felt that labor unions, if you supported them, you're supporting violence, you're supporting somebody who could possibly injure you. Knights of Labor becomes controversial for that. And a lot of the labor unions or labor strikes from the other side were the Knights of Labor. Okay? Next one that you need to know is if you'll double star socialism. This is the most important one to know for all of these labor unions. Now, technically, it was a labor movement, not a labor union. Socialism, though, what you need to know for socialism is you first off need to highlight the word Eugene Debs. Eugene Debs. Now, he is the leader. It's one of those names that you have to immediately, when you see Eugene Debs, you have to think socialism. The big thing about socialism, though, that is the thing that you need to know is you need to know controversy. Controversy. And again, anarchy. People fear socialism. A lot of people, even in today's world, fear socialism. The idea of this communal thing, everybody's the same, people don't like that in the United States. As socialism rises, people begin to have concern over whether or not this is anarchy. If you'll also put next to this violence, pretty much every violent act that occurs in a strike, people blame on socialism. They throw it out there. It's kind of like in today's world, people blame things on communism or socialism as well. That's why there was all that controversy with Bernie Sanders in the presidential election, is because people in the United States have a fear of socialism, this idea of communal living. Now, it's not necessarily saying socialism isn't a good thing, because a lot of countries have it, and it's really successful for them, but the United States fears it. Yes?
Was it actually their fault, or were they just escaping?
I would say, based on what we know, they were a scapegoat. I think that people blame, because people automatically think labor unions is communism or socialism, and so I think it automatically has that controversy to it. But there's very rare circumstances where you could say this person was a socialist. Now, if you want a good example of that scapegoating, Eugene Debs, after a bomb went off at one of the socialist gatherings, he was actually arrested, put into jail for 20 years. Fun fact about Eugene Debs that you might have seen, he actually got second place in the presidential election in 1920. The reason why that's interesting is because he was in jail. And he would have technically been in jail his entire presidency had he won. But he did get second place. So that's pretty high even though he was in jail.
How do
Yes.
you run from jail?
You can, Mickey Mouse wins every year in several areas. You can vote for anybody you want. Technically, as long as you fulfill the requirements, you can vote for anybody. Last year, there's nothing in the state legislature of, it's like Michigan or something, that says that you have to be a certain age to run for a state office. And they had a bunch of freshmen run for office in the state legislature, and one of them won. So, because there's no time limit. So as long as you meet the requirements, you can vote for anybody. In the United States, all you have to be is 35. And that technically didn't come out until after Eugene Debs. So you have to be 35 and born in the United States. So, or in a territory, or etc. So technically, you could vote for anybody. Go vote for Mr. Bingham. I would not suggest doing that as a write-in candidate. I would suggest actually being an informed decision. But if he runs, you could. But technically, you can vote him into office. That's why up in Alaska, there was that goat that won. Because there was nothing in the state legislature that said it had to be a human.
It's Alaska. They get very bored up there.
Well, there's like, all over the place, there's like a cat that's a mayor and stuff like that. So, I don't know about a moose. Okay,
Mr. Bingham would be like...
take this paper and flip it over. Mr. Bingham is like the nicest person ever.
That'd be a great president.
He's the leader that...
He is so nice. Watching him at lunch from the faculty lounge is fun. Because he's always like being awesome to people.
He's a nice guy.
He is super nice. Okay, listen. Okay, on this strike side, what you need to do is you need to star Haymarket Riot. And in the Haymarket Riot, above the word riot, if you were to write down the word square, like the shape, the reason why is because this will help you remember it a little bit more. Next to this, you need to put anarchy / terrorism / bomb. Now, hopefully in your research, you learned about the Haymarket Square riot, where basically this labor union gets together in the Haymarket Square, and they are going to do a rally. Now, when the rally ends, everybody went home. So all the people went home, and then all of the labor union leaders went to a bar, drank some root beer. It was a great time. Okay? While they were at... Yes, that is the school-appropriate version of that conversation. So they go off to the bar, and while they're at the bar, a bomb goes off where they had just held that rally. Now, there's really no evidence linking this labor union or these leaders to that, other than the fact that it was in the same location as their rally. All those labor union leaders, which were 9 of them, get arrested and they get hanged and executed for their crimes. So basically what we're talking about here is this is one of those where people start to, and if you want to put it down, fear labor unions. Because now labor unions are going to blow people up. Now labor unions are going to go and destroy people. Granted, there was no real evidence. Basically, the conviction was out of fear. But people begin to accuse labor unions of this anarchy because of this event. The next one that you need is the Homestead Strike. Star that. And for the Homestead Strike, what you need to know is you need to know Carnegie Steel. That is the most common reference. If you see Carnegie talking about labor unions, it is more than likely a Homestead Strike question. That's really all you need to know for the Homestead Strike, is you need to know Carnegie Steel. And remember Henry Clay Frick, that guy with the dam that we talked about, Johnstown flood? That's the guy that's going to run all that. Carnegie's over in Europe. The last thing you need to know is, don't star it, but you need to know the Pullman Strike. And below the word Pullman Strike, you need to write down political cartoon. Political cartoon. Now, the reason I say political cartoon is because there is a political cartoon. Maybe I can find it. And that's this one right here, and it is one of the most common labor union sourcings on the AP exam. There's not a lot of political cartoons during this time about labor unions. This is one of the only ones. What you need to see here is, if you notice, the easiest way to remember Pullman is you'll see the Pullman right here, the Pullman strike. That's what it's in reference to. But all of this right here, this is like those low wages, the high rent, the workers being squished by that right here. So what you're seeing is basically it's describing why there are labor unions. So the most common thing that you'll see with Pullman strike is you'll see it as a sourcing, which is the one up on the board of the Pullman worker squishing or Pullman guy squishing the worker. Okay, so that's what you need to know for this paper. So you can put this paper away. And you need to grab out your tree notes. Would somebody also pull out the melting pot notes and make sure that we got through all that? That was the cook one? Okay.
I think we have internal migration.
Did we? Internal migration you're fine with. We talked about Boss Tweed though, yeah? Okay, good. So on the other side, will you quickly for me grab out the melting pot notes? That's what the person's doing. He's making stew. Remember we talked about stew.
What are we talking about?
Grab out stew notes. Now at the very bottom, there was two that we didn't cover because, as usual, again, love you guys, but we got behind again. But on these notes at the bottom, the one where it says internal migration, it is true all the time. If you will just highlight for me where it says people move to cities, and I don't remember how it's worded because I don't have it in front of me, but people moving to cities. And then if you will just highlight child labor on the next one. We will talk later on. Are you looking for these notes?
Yeah.
These notes should have been at the very top. And then somebody must have flipped it. That is it.
No, I'm looking for the one.
So did you look where it says last class's notes? Okay. And then go ahead and move to your tree notes. So now we're on tree notes. Grabbing out tree notes. Please don't steal his glasses. Give them back.
He's hurting my arm.
Please let go of his arm and you can give him back his glasses. Thank you. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We are behind in this class. Now, I know that's not really a shocker because that's pretty much every time. But we need to catch up. And certain people might contribute to that more than others. So please be a little bit quieter. All right, so what we're talking about in this one is we're going to be talking about the differences. Oh, we didn't do any of the growth of cities. Which means we are way more behind than I thought. Okay, just kidding. Talk amongst yourselves real quick. I have to switch PowerPoints. Come on. Okay. out you were more behind than I remembered you being behind. So that was my fault. Okay, so we are going to quickly go over this because we are super behind in this class. So, basically, what is going to happen, okay, listen, is the cities are going to begin to massively grow in the United States. We begin to start to grow these cities through what is known as a skyscraper. If you will please write that down, where it says growth of cities, where it says skyscrapers. Or right where it says growth of cities, excuse me. Now, basically, what these skyscrapers begin to do is it begins to grow scrapers. It begins to grow New York up. Sam. So, for example, you can see in these pictures right here, they begin to grow massively up. Now, the reason why, and if you'll put next to this, if you'll do an arrow and write the word steel. As steel with Carnegie Steel becomes more and more popular, it begins to grow these different skyscrapers up into the air. Now, for example, you get to see these really cool photos of people beginning to create these different skyscrapers. Now, the most famous one, and if you'll make sure it's down on your notes, is the Empire State Building. Empire State Building. Now, the Empire State Building becomes probably the most famous out of all the skyscrapers at this time. It kind of becomes representative of the grandeur of New York City. One second. Now, when they're building the Empire State Building, though, that's when you start to get the really famous photos of the growth of the cities, like this, where basically people are beginning to build these massive skyscrapers, and they're really just fun because of the fact that you got to see these. Now, a lot of times people start to say, why aren't these people scared? Well, back then there was no safety harnesses, so you kind of had to go through and live the way that everybody lived back then. We're a lot more cautious now in the United States. This is probably one of the most famous pictures of this skyscraper era. The thing that you need to know about this one, by the way, does anybody know where this is at?
New York.
Well, yes. Specific location.
Isn't it in the building?
It's in a building. What building is it? No.
Rockefeller.
Rockefeller. So this is Don't say that word. Okay? So this is Rockefeller Center. When you go, I still heard it. Teachers have a really good way of hearing swear words. So, as it goes up, you actually can go and you can sit on this bar that they have. They recreated this picture. Now, fun facts about cities. They were super fun. For example, as you see right here, this is a dead horse lying in the street.
Nice.
They were completely filthy. Basically, people, as they were building these cities, nobody really cared about sanitation. You had that chamber pot, you threw it outside the window. If somebody's below, well, sucks for them. Nobody really knew that this was an unhealthy scenario. Also, we had a ton of pollution, so people were getting lung cancer, couldn't figure out why. Our cities were basically absolute awful places until we began to change them in the future. Okay, so that brings us to the updated, and now we're where everybody else should be. So, will you bracket for me where it says upper class, and then bracket all the way down to the very last bullet, which is the lower class? And if you will put next to that, know the difference. Know the difference. Now, we're going to start of understanding, so this is the difference basically between the upper, middle, and lower classes in the cities, especially New York and things like that. Those are probably the best examples of that. Now, when we talk about the upper class, though, there's one little disclaimer that I have to say. Because I know that I work at Skyline, and some of you might be in the upper class. As I start to go and talk about this, because I'm going to start to talk negatively about it, just want to make sure you understand we're talking negatively about the upper class in the 1800s. Okay? So don't feel like this is bad about you as we go to talk about this. Cool? That's my disclaimer. Please don't be offended. Okay, great. So don't be offended. I gave you the warning. So if you will highlight where it says newly rich. So our upper class during this time is going to be our brand new rich. And if you'll write next to that, the industrialists. Industrialists. So these are your brand new Rockefellers, your Carnegies, your Vanderbilts. People who have money, and because of that, they're going to spend that money a lot. And this is what is known as conscious consumption, which is a highlighted starred term. Now let me explain what conscious consumption basically means. Conscious consumption, and if you want to write an arrow away from that, that is the stereotypical rich person. Stereotypical rich person. Now basically what that means is you're rich, and you want to make sure that every single person around you knows that you are rich. This is the person that goes on Instagram and posts like pictures of them like with $100 bills fanned out, and they're like fanning themselves with $100 bills. Or this is the person that is going to, let's say, buy a $900,000 car, leave it out in their driveway to make sure people see it, but never drive it. This is the person that wants people to know that they are rich, and they're going to do anything they can to make sure you know that they are rich. Now, at this time, what that means is that you are going to be going into that stereotypical 1800s rich person. So, for example, on Sundays, you get dressed up fancy, you go out to the tea parties with your friends, then you go and learn how to be able to play the violin or the cello, and you have a private tutor, and you go to Europe for the summers, every single summer for like 5 months. This is the idea that you're going to throw these massive parties to show everybody how rich you are. Back in the olden days of the 2000s, is that there was this TV show called My Super Sweet 16. Some of you might have heard of it. Basically what happened is these people threw these $300,000, $400,000 Super Sweet 16s to show everybody how cool that they really were. So, for example, I'm going to give you one modern day example. So last year, around the world, there was the richest wedding in history that they know of. Now, it's not including the royal weddings, because a lot of that budget goes to like security and stuff like that. But this wedding spent $450 million on this wedding. Now, what happened was, and this was found out afterward, is that this girl had an ex-boyfriend that was kind of the person that she really liked. So she threw this entire big lavish party to impress him, and then a month afterwards divorced the guy and got married to her ex-boyfriend. Now, the wedding dress itself was $65 million. So when we talk about this, it was a show, right? Well, it is diamond. I mean, every single piece is like $1 million diamond all over the place. Now, listen, back in the 1800s, another example was this family had a 1-year-old. They were returning a year old. They decided to have a birthday party. It was 1 hour long. It cost $350,000. Now that is in back then's money, which is about $5 million in today's money. The idea is you spend money and you don't care about it because you want people to know that you are rich. That is the upper class of the 1800s. Okay? Then, when we get to the middle class, the thing that you need to know about the middle class is these are going to be, well, we're getting there, yes. If you will highlight where it says white-collar jobs. These are your business owners, your doctors, your dentists, things like that. And people say, well, I thought those people were rich. Not back then. Doctors were not rich back then. They were paid just as much as somebody who owns a business. Now, they are also what is known as a WASP, which if you will highlight that and star it. And this is a term that you'll need to know for the rest of this AP class. Now, a WASP is basically describing what the stereotypical middle class is. They are white, they are Anglo-Saxon, which means they are from Europe, in particular England, and they are Protestant. That's the vast majority of the class during this time. Now, one other thing that happens during this is that you're also going to have the middle class be focused on families. So if you'll make sure to highlight families. Traditionally, your big families are going to be that middle class family. They live out in the suburbs, which aren't called suburbs at this time, but moving away from the city. Now, one thing about this is that the middle class didn't want to live in the city. It was gross. It was nasty. And so what happens is they start this movement, which is called the City Beautiful movement, which this is a starred term. A starred term. The City Beautiful movement was basically an attempt to be able to get people to go into the cities. Now, this guy named Frederick Olmsted, which if you will highlight his name, he's one of those people that you have to identify Olmsted, and you have to immediately think in your head, City Beautiful movement. Now, what happens with Frederick Olmsted is he wants to make it so that people want to go into the cities. So what he does is he says, instead of having a giant skyscraper-filled city with all these all over the place, we are instead going to have skyscrapers and then parks and then little areas where you can go with your friends and eat and all these different things so that it's not just big skyscrapers, it's really green and beautiful. So when you go to look at like a model like this would be considered like the perfect City Beautiful movement image. Basically, you can see right here that they're going to make sure that all of this is green and not just these ugly buildings. So the best example of this is Central Park. And if you'll write down next to City Beautiful movement, Central Park. Now, Central Park is going to become the most famous out of all of the City Beautiful movements. He basically encourages them to be able to take this is Fifth Avenue across the street, and convert it into this, which is in Central Park. Now, the idea was to make sure that you could be able to go to a place and escape. And if you've been to Central Park, most of the time, unless you look really hard, you can't see those skyscrapers because of the fact that you're all surrounded by this greenery and things like that. Okay? Last one is the lower... Oh, by the way, it's the Central Park. If you were to take all of this and sell all that land at current modern-day pricing, it'd be several $billions. But they don't do that. They keep it. And now only things that are added are things like the zoos and things like that in Central Park. So the last one is the lower class, which we've already talked about, so I'm just going to kind of briefly go over it. If you will highlight the word tenements, which we've talked about before, you should know that. And then if you'll highlight immigrants. Now, as we've talked about before, the life of the lower class in New York City is going to be awful. Really terrible place. Thing about this is that if you guys remember, this was on your quiz too, who created this image? Who's the photographer? That one guy. You're correct, but what's his name? Okay, if you don't know that, write it down on your paper. It's Jacob.
Jacob Frederick.
No.
Jacob Olsen.
Oh, let's not guess the last names. It's going to take you a while. Jacob Riis, which is R-I-I-S. And he writes a book, and you might want to write it down, called How the Other Half Lives. So if you guys remember, he's going to create these photographs of the tenements and encourages them to begin to change it. And we'll talk about that way more in about a week. Okay? So go ahead and grab out your new notes for me.
Okay.
New notes. I'm not going to spoil what it is for you. If you complete it, you'll know what it is. Okay. Now, one thing that I want to point out, speaking of the quiz, if you are one of my 4 students who did not complete the quiz, that was assigned, that was due on Friday, just let you know, you're now going to have to come and chat with me individually. Because that quiz is now locked online and it has a password that you're required to have. So if you're one of those students, make sure you come and talk with me because you won't be able to access that quiz online anymore. It's locked. And then you have to come have a chat with me. It'll be fun. Okay. So heading into our brand new notes. So, where'd my finger go? Oh, here it is. Okay. Now at the top of this paper, I want you to write HC, which means historical context. And then HC equals the Civil War. Basically, everything in the Gilded Age can be contextualized with the Civil War. So, Gilded Age as a whole, right? Growth after the Civil War, movement, things like that. Now we're going to be talking about the movement west. So basically, what's going to happen is during the Civil War, we have all this fighting, all this death. People just want to be able to get away from it and move on. And so what they're going to do is because of that, they're going to move west where there's not all this fighting. Now, this is because of the railroads. And the railroads are very important during the Gilded Age because they do a lot of different things. On this, if you will highlight, created through government federal subsidies. Now, let me explain. We're going to look at some maps. Okay? After I show you these maps, your goal is to, with your thumb, so this is an activity that's like a PE activity, so make sure you're stretched out so you don't injure yourself. Okay? So, you're either going to determine if there are more railroads, the same amount of railroads, or less railroads. Okay? So that's what you need to do. Make sure your thumb's stretched out before we start. Okay, so this is in 1860, and I want you to think, what happens to the railroads? Everything in red is a railroad. So now we're going to head to 1870. So think about it. You don't have to guess now because you don't know what could happen. Going into 1880. 1880. And then finally, 1890. So, with your thumb, is there more, equal, or less amounts of railroads? Go ahead and put them up. And if you're trying to be silly, let's think about it seriously.
There's less at the beginning.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Okay? So, railroads skyrocket. And if you'll make sure to write that down, railroads skyrocket. Railroads. Basically, what's going to happen is you have this thing called a federal subsidy. What that basically means is that the federal government, as in your national government, helps out that company to create this transportation system. If you want a modern day example, you might have heard of this guy called Elon Musk. Everybody heard of him?
Yeah.
What company does he own?
Tesla.
And if you're like, I've never heard of this, we talked about him in class with the Thailand submarine and things like that. Remember that? Okay? Right now, his company is creating, and I wouldn't call it a railroad because it's like a transportation system. It's called the Hyperloop. And it is from San Francisco to LA. The goal of this is that you would be able to get on it and get from San Francisco to LA, which right now is a 6-hour drive and about 5.5 hours by train. You would be able to get there in 45 minutes. Now, basically, this Hyperloop, what it is if you think about it in your mind, if you've ever seen like Disneyland's Space Mountain or Matterhorn, it's basically single seats, and this tube is about 6 feet tall. You sit in these single seats, and you go at 700 miles an hour through this loop. Now, how they're able to budget this, because this project right now is estimated at $480 billion, is how much it's going to cost to pay for it. And they're 8 years behind schedule, so it's a little off.
You're like us.
Yes, like you guys are behind. Now, I'm not saying you're like Elon Musk.
Well, I'm not a great person.
Okay, listen. So what happens is California is paying that company to, one, do this in California first and not someplace like the East Coast, and two, helping them actually fund this project. That's what a federal government subsidy does. It helps you fund it, so it encourages it to be in your area, and it encourages you to actually do this work. So what happens is the federal government begins to pay them to create these railroads during the Gilded Age. Now, the other things that you need to highlight on this is, actually, instead of highlighting, use your pen or pencil, where it says goals of railroad development. If you'll do number 1 is to open new markets. Again, as you move and as you go, just like when we talked about when England came over, you want to be able to open up new marketplaces. And then 2, increase westward migration. Move people out of the west. Or east, excuse me. And then the effects, if you'll do 1, 2, and 3 here, so the effects are number 1, it's an increase in consumerism and consumption, which we'll talk about in just a second. 2, westward expansion. And 3, we'll talk about next class, which is conflict with Native Americans. Now, one important aspect of these railroads is a thing called the Transcontinental Railroad, which none of you have ever heard about before, correct? Yeah. Well, in the Utah Studies curriculum, because I went and looked it up, it's 37% of the curriculum is the Transcontinental Railroad.
Big deal.
So, hopefully you've learned about this. So we're going to review it really quick. Okay? Now, you guys should remember that back in the day, there was a thing called the Gold Rush. What year did the Gold Rush start?
1849.
1849. I always think of the 49ers. I guess that's the one date you guys got, so that's awesome. So good job. Okay? Well, I had a bunch of people say that the Civil War started in 1790 on their essays, so...
Really?
Yep.
That's
So... Okay. So, in the California Gold Rush, you wanted to get there first. Person gets there first, gets the most gold. The problem is, It's super, well, that's another problem. It's super, super slow to be able to get there. You have 3 options. Number 1, you go by wagon. It's super dangerous. Takes about 8 months to get across. By the time you get there, all the gold is probably gone. Option number 2, you take a very expensive boat ride around the bottom of South America. It takes 7 months, and probably by the time you get there, all the gold is gone. But there is some good news. There's a 1-month route. You have to take a boat to Panama. There's no Panama Canal at this time. You have to then trek across only 22 miles, which really isn't that bad compared to the fact that this is thousands of miles. And then you go around in another boat and you make it to San Francisco, which sounds awesome, right? Well, 88% of the people die from yellow fever. So you run a big risk. You could go get the gold first, which again doesn't really exist, but you're probably going to die of yellow fever. So here's the problem. They need to figure out a way that we can be able to get people across. So Abraham Lincoln signs a thing called the Pacific Railroad Act. If you will write that down next to the railroads, or next to Transcontinental Railroad, is the Pacific Railroad Act. Now, the Pacific Railroad Act is going to be signed in 1862. What's going on in 1862? Say it louder. Be more confident. The Civil War. Good. Okay. Now, during the Civil War, the reason Abraham Lincoln signs this, he really thinks the Civil War is going to end in 62. So he doesn't see a problem in signing this and funding this railroad. But obviously it gets delayed, which is why it isn't finished until 1869. But they're going to start to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, you know that there are 2 different railroad companies that are going to do this. And I did notice that I switched them on your paper. So just do a little arrow so that you know to switch them. They're probably never going to ask this. But the California one, where it says Union Pacific Rail Line from California, that is actually the Central Pacific. So if you want to cross that out or whatever, they're probably never going to ask you it, but I don't want to be wrong on your notes. Central Pacific starts in California, and then the Union Pacific starts in Chicago. The easiest way to be able to remember this, by the way, is if you look at this map right here, the Union Pacific starts in the Union. That's the easiest way to be able to remember that. Okay? Now, they begin a great race to be able to make it and get the most amount of land. Basically, they did competition from the U.S. government. The U.S. government said that for every mile that you create of railroad track, you receive 10 square miles around that area. So basically, the more railroad track that you lay down, what do you get more of? Land, which is basically money, right? Now, the thing is about this is, whose land is it?
The Native Americans.
It's the Native Americans, right? Did they get any compensation?
Probably not.
No. In fact, typically the railroads would show up and say, by the way, you're now moving to this new location. And we'll talk about later kind of the effects of that. But regardless, though, the great competition of being able to move west is going to happen during this time. Now, basically what's going to happen is that these natives are going to be pretty upset. In fact, they would start to dismantle railroad tracks, do everything they could to encourage them not to, but their land kept getting taken away, and we'll talk about the impact of that next class. But regardless, though, another thing that happens is the creation of railroad towns. So all of these railroad workers are getting money, but where are they going to go to be able to spend it? So all these towns pop up, and they literally travel with the railroads. Problem is, they weren't exactly the most nicest places to be. They were basically places of prostitution and gambling and alcohol. So it was a really pretty, it was like the old mining towns. It was very unclean and immoral. But regardless, though, it's going to follow the railroad tracks. Now, one thing that I kind of messed up on your notes as well, up on Gilded Age railroads, which this is technically true, but I'd rather have it in the Transcontinental Railroad. If you will do an arrow for where it says workers, Asian, Irishmen, and immigrants, and arrow it down to the Transcontinental Railroad area. And if you will, in particular, highlight or star Asians and Irishmen. Reason why is because they can be the cheapest paid workers. Now, the one thing, though, is that there's going to be massive discrimination, but one of them is going to be more discriminated against than the other. Which one do you think is going to be more discriminated against?
Probably the Asians.
The Asians, right? And we've talked about that before. It's very classic during this time. Let me give you an example. If you were Irish, yes, you were paid less, similar to the Chinese, but you were given free housing, and free food, and you could live right along the railroad. If you were Chinese, you had to live at least 2 miles away from the railroad. You were not giving any housing or food, and you were not allowed to use the bathrooms that were along the railroad. You had to go out and find your own. But here's the good news. So this is where the Asians are really, really smart, because especially the Chinese figured out that the water next to the railroads kept getting polluted from the railroad workers. So they would actually take the water, boil it, and drink it, and they never told the Irishmen or the workers that were the bosses. So what happened is all the people who were Asian and Chinese would be super healthy, and then everybody else got dysentery. So there is positives, because while they were discriminated, they were healthier, and they were able to not have so much diarrhea. It was a good time. Okay, now, as we know by the old legend of Utah, they are going to come together on May 10th of 1869, and they are going to finish the railroad at what location? Promontory Point, which is technically a lie, because it was actually like 5 miles away from Promontory Point, but that wasn't a pretty picture, so they moved it closer to this spot right here. And they're going to put the Golden Spike in, which again wasn't really real because these weren't really railroad tracks right here. But what's going to happen, because it actually came together in Ogden, but they moved it to another spot for the picture. And then you have this picture right here. Now, fun fact, this year is actually the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike.
Hey.
Yay. So they're going to have a bunch of festivities throughout the year. It's kind of shut down right now, so please don't go there because it isn't open.
Why is it shut down right now?
Because the government shut down.
Oh.
And so the good news is hopefully we'll be able to get out of that shutdown. I know they've said it could take a couple of years, but the hope would be that the government shutdown stops, and then you guys will all be able to go to the 150th anniversary.
Oh, yeah.
They're doing all these. Listen, watch up here. So they're going to be doing all of these different really cool things, and the good news is on the actual day itself, which is May 10th, they're going to have this really big celebration. They're going to recreate the Golden Spike. It's going to be awesome. And the good news for you guys is that is the same day as the AP exam. So you can finish the AP exam and be like, you know what, I want more history, and you can go drive out to Promontory Point and enjoy it. It's an hour and a half, about. But you know what, though? It's a great day of history, and then you'll always remember May 10th as a historical day.
You gotta plan, because, on that crazy day,
Oh, it's going to be,
the traffic is probably gonna be an hour and a half.
Yeah, and they didn't have a parking lot until this year. Their parking lot before last year only could hold 20 cars. And so this year they made a new parking lot. Okay, now, moving into the next section. If you will highlight on consumer goods and services, cause federal subsidies for transportation. So basically, this is one of those like cause and effects. So cause, federal subsidies create transportation. This creates the railroads. The railroads create what is called consumerism. And if you'll write that in the margins, it creates consumerism. Basically, what happens is people begin to want to buy things that are more wants rather than needs. Yeah, you can buy food and shelter and things like that, but now you're going to start to buy things that you actually want. Now, this starts with what is known, as we talked about before, as conscious consumption. I'm going to turn off the lights because I have fancy pictures for you guys.
Oh, boy.
So, what happens is, remember, conscious consumption is at the upper, middle, or lower class? Upper. They want to show off how much wealth that they have. So they are going to make sure that their houses look huge and beautiful and rich and wealthy. And I'm going to give you an example of one of those people. Now, this guy, I actually mentioned him in a story before, and we did not have somebody actually get it right yet. So 3B, I'm hoping on you.
John Jacob Jingle.
No. Okay. His name is Jay Gould. Does anybody remember what story we learned him from?
Oh, the thing where he...
Like the train around the house.
Ah, that's the first class that got it. Good job.
Good job, Steven.
So, do you guys remember when we talked about the story of somebody who Vanderbilt built his railroad around the house of his competitor?
I really don't remember this, actually.
Okay. Well, you can go listen to the lecture. It was fun. Now, Jay Gould has this estate in a place called Tarrytown. It's also where the Legend of Sleepy Hollow started. And this is his house right here. His house just sold a couple of years ago for his entire estate was about $170 million.
That's a lot of money.
And if you've ever seen like 4 Weddings or Say Yes to the Dress, they have it all the time here.
Really?
Just to have an event at that location. That doesn't include anything else. Just being on the property for 1 hour is $100,000. Okay?
That's what I make in a year.
Now, I would hope so. You'd be really rich. Now, okay, listen. No, I would hope that you would make like a ton of money.
Thanks.
Now, at this location called the Lyndhurst Estate, I want you to notice something. This is the entryway to this guy's house. Okay? Now, if you notice, he has this right here. This is actually a statue of himself.
Cute.
So he has a statue. He has 10 different statues of himself in different facial positions and things like that.
Well, you know.
The other thing I want to ask you is, what type of material is in the background here?
Marble.
It's marble, right? It's not marble.
It's plastic.
Wood.
No. It is. Hey, if you listen, I'll tell you. You don't have to guess every single time. Most of the time I say rhetorical questions. Okay? So this is actually painted to look like marble. The reason why is because it costs 4 times more to paint it than it does to actually install the house with marble. So, when you look at all this, this is all painted on. So if he had actually marbled his house, it would have cost about $350,000 to marble his whole house. Instead, he paid around $1.7 million to get it painted to look like marble. Okay? Now, another thing about this is during the late 1800s, bowling gets invented. Now, the thing about bowling is that at this time, we don't have our modern conveniences. There's nothing that can bring the ball back to you. There's nothing that can put the pins up for you. So you had to hire people to do that for you. And if you went to a bowling alley and things like that, you could do that. Jay Gould puts in his backyard this bowling alley for his kids. He has 2 kids. He lives there for 5 years with the bowling alley installed before he leaves. However, out of those 5 years, they only went bowling twice. And during that time, they had a full-time employed staff whose job was to wait there for you, and they were all little 12-year-olds, so they were getting paid about 10 cents a day. And your whole job was the 5 of them sat there waiting for the Goulds to come and bowl. Do you guys see how this is like massive conscious consumption, right? Being able to pay a staff that you're not even going to go do something with. Now, who has seen The Greatest Showman?
I saw it.
Okay.
Zac Efron was
If not, hopefully you've at least heard of this movie. Now, if you like this movie, which I like this movie too, I think the music's great. The problem is, it is 99.9% historically inaccurate. It's really, really bad. Because this guy named P.T. Barnum, in this movie, they make him seem like really cool and really nice, and he eventually comes around and learns stuff, things like that. The reality is that wasn't what P.T. Barnum was about. P.T. Barnum starts in 1830, and his big show of his attraction is this woman right here. Now, she was a slave that he bought, and she was deaf, and she was blind, and she was about 90 years old. So she didn't really understand what was happening to her.
George Washington's slave?
Yes, I was just about to say that. Okay? It was not his slave, though, but let me explain. So what happened is that he starts to showcase this slave around the United States. Now, what he said that this slave was what is called a wet nurse. So what a wet nurse does is, this is typically with richer people or people who can't breastfeed, is that a wet nurse basically provides that for somebody else's child. So in this case, P.T. Barnum says this is the wet nurse of George Washington. So basically, she nursed George Washington. Now, if you do the math, though, that doesn't make any sense. George Washington was born in like 1730-ish, so that would make her around 140 years old. Now, what happens is that he advertises that this lady is 140 years old, and she was the wet nurse, and things like 161 now, something like that. And so she goes around, and by the way, just make sure you understand she was deaf and blind. Basically, they had communicated to her that she didn't even know she was off a plantation. All she knew is that she was sitting there every day, and she sat there, and people would come and pay 10 cents to go and see her. Now, when she dies, he decides to kind of exploit her a little bit more. They actually do a public autopsy of her on the pier of New York City. About 15,000 people show up. They pay $2 a piece to come and watch this autopsy. And then during the autopsy, it is magically revealed that she was only around 90 years old and not this 161, and that she had lied about her age.
So he lied?
Yes, he did lie. She was not the wet nurse.
What?
I know. Now, the other thing, too, is that they also premiered the very first mermaid, live mermaid. You guys, well, not live. The mermaid skeleton. You guys want to see the mermaid?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So this is the mermaid that they premiered. Now, as you can see, people love this idea. It's kind of like a Ripley's Believe It or Not. People love this idea of like mystery and fantasy and being real. Well, P.T. Barnum, just like in the movie, his museum does burn down in 1864. And things begin to change. People no longer want the fake. They want the real. And so people begin to go and see attractions that are showing the real thing. Now, one of those is at a thing called Coney Island. Anybody ever been to Coney Island? One of the first amusement parks in the United States. It's pretty fun. I went there over the summer. Coney Island basically is the very first thing to premiere things like roller coasters and things like that. But you could also pay to go see these sideshow attractions. And one of the most popular ones was actually seeing premature babies. Now let me explain why. Okay? This is actually a good thing. Wait. Before you say it's sad, let me explain what happened. So basically, if you were back in the 1800s and you had a premature baby, they were going to die. There was no medicine to be able to help them. There was no ability in NICU or anything like that. Your child was going to die. So what happened is in the late 1800s, these showmen started to go to the hospitals, and if a premature baby was born, they would say, look, you're aware as well as we're aware that your baby's going to die. We'll buy your child off of you. We'll try to save its life. And for a lot of women, they're like, yeah, it's going to die anyways. You have to realize mortality and stuff. People were so used to all their kids dying, it wasn't that big of a deal to go and sell your child. So they give the child to these doctors. What happens is these doctors actually create the very first incubator system. With the money from these sideshows of seeing the premature babies, they actually create the very first incubator system. It is the modern day NICU. If it wasn't for this sideshow, we wouldn't have the technology we do today of the neonatal intensive care unit. So while it does seem really bad, the funding and the research that happened because of it actually helped. On the other side, though, also really, really bad things happened at this sideshow. Remember, people want to see the real. They want to see what's going on in the world. So they would go and they would pay to go see an African child. So, for example, this is at the Bronx Zoo. So he is actually in the chimpanzee enclosure. They put him in the chimpanzee enclosure. You could go pay 20 cents to go see a black child in the chimpanzee enclosure. See the real deal African. If you see this right here on the right, this is a Filipino child at Coney Island. Notice how they have this post right here, and she is actually tied to the post. You can go see 10 cents, you can go see a Filipino. So when we go to see this like reality thing, there was really good things like the incubator thing, but there was really bad things like this. And this was not the only people who did this. This was really present until like World War I, when things started to change. Now, people also started to go and take vacations, and you should, fingers crossed, know where this is. Where is this?
Parliament.
Not Parliament. We don't have a Parliament. It's in Utah. Saltaire. Yeah, it's called Saltaire, which like the modern day one is like Salt Palace is like the nickname of it. That's what Salt Palace Convention Center is named after. Now, basically what happens is that this Saltaire becomes a number one tourist destination in the area. People go and flock to it. It's actually extremely popular until this era kind of ends. People started to go on vacations, people including the Vanderbilts. This is the Vanderbilt Lodge up in northern New York. It's called Sagamore, Great Camp Sagamore. This property was split up after a bitter divorce. One of the members of that sold their half for $170 million. So if we talk about how much money this was for Vanderbilt, it was this right here. Now, the other thing that happens is also the mail order catalog. If you'll star this one, by the way, it's the most commonly referenced on the AP exam. Oh, that was dumb of me. Okay, so mail order catalogs are probably the most famous out of all of them. Basically, what would happen is as we move west, you need still to have access to all these goods and services. So you would get this mail order catalog, send your money in, they would send you your product, and it becomes really popular with this consumerism idea. Okay, and one more thing, this was like a little added thing. Another thing is people love this idea of like the World's Fair. And so, for example, when they did this in 1893 in Chicago, They did this whole World's Fair where they did have where you could go and see people from Africa and the Philippines and things like that. It was also where the Ferris wheel was invented because they wanted to create some sort of a big sculpture that would rival the Eiffel Tower because that was supposed to be like the big thing over in France. So lots of like big in-your-face kind of things. All right, so that brings us to the Old West. Okay? Now this is through what is known as the Homestead Act, which is a starred term. It's very important knowing westward migration. And with the Homestead Act, if you will also highlight, provided 160 acres of land. Basically what is going to happen is that they are going to make it so that you can be able to move west for free. All you have to do is you have to farm the land. And if you will highlight where it says farm. So here's basically what would happen. As people begin to move west, they need to be able to get land. They would get land through this thing known as the Homestead Act. So all of this land in red comes up with the Homestead Act. Now remember, whose land is this? Native Americans. They didn't receive any compensation for this. Somebody would show up, take their land, and be like, oh, by the way, this is my land now. Didn't really have a choice in that. We'll talk about the effects of that next class. Now, who knows what university this is? Not Ohio State. Oklahoma. Good. Now, this is Oklahoma. Anybody know what their mascot is? Yeah, good job. It is the Sooners. Now, who knows what a Sooner is? Exactly. You're like, what kind of a mascot is a Sooner? That's not a word. So, let me explain what a Sooner is. Okay, so here's basically how they did the Homestead Act. Jacob, make sure you're not falling asleep. Okay. So what happens is basically on Oklahoma's line, they say everybody who wants a free 160 acres, everybody needs to line up on the line of Oklahoma. So everyone gets their horses, their families, their wagons, they're all sitting on the starting line. And basically it was an Easter egg hunt. When they shot the gun at 9 o'clock, everybody would take off, and wherever you put your flag, you get all 160 acres around that spot. Now, it basically is an Easter egg hunt. Who can get there first? Well, a Sooner goes magically to a part of the line where there's nobody else. And there's no law enforcement there or anything like that. So if they accidentally leave a little bit early, nobody's going to see them. The Sooners are the people who left the line too soon. Basically, and I'm not saying the Oklahoma Sooners are cheaters. I'm saying back in 65 they were cheaters because they're the ones who leave too soon and they take off and get the best land by leaving early. Okay? That's what a Sooner is. So next time you go and see Oklahoma play, you can go understand it's the Sooners. So basically what happens is they are going to leave and they are going to start to farm in the West. Now, as they go to farm in the West, they have to be able to do this in order to develop it. They would live in these like grass houses, so think Little House on the Prairie, and their entire families would live in this one single house. Those houses were about a third of the size of this room, and typically families ranged between 10 and 15 people who lived out in the West. Also, they would make them into the hills to make them more warm, such as this one with a horse on top, or maybe, for example, this one with a cow. Now, when you lived in there, these were one room. So one side, you had a bed. That was where your parents slept. The kids slept on the floor. And then on the other side was your kitchen, and that was it. There was no like luxury or different things like that. Now, maybe. The other thing that happens too is that ranching begins to become much more popular during this time. Because if you didn't farm that acreage, you lost it after a few years. So everybody had to begin to develop the West and make it better. Now this begins the mass cattle drives as well. So like in Texas, they start in Texas. That's why they're called the Longhorns. They go up to Chicago where the meat packing is at. And they are now going to be the major era of the cowboys. Now think about the cowboy era in the Old West. So I want you to think of this. This is Wells Fargo's logo. You might say, why the heck is this logo? That doesn't make any sense. Well, back in the Old West, Wells Fargo's a bank, right? They had to be able to provide banking to people who were outside of the East Coast. So they would have these mobile banks that had all the money in it, and they would travel west. Based on what you know about the Old West, what problem does this bring?
Bandits.
It is the bank robberies and things like that, right?
It's easier
Now-
to banks when the bankers come to you.
Yes. Okay.
Also, when the bank
Now, some of you might have heard of a video game called Red Dead Redemption. Has anybody ever played that video game in the past or seen it? Some of you are like, I don't want to admit it, but I played it 12 hours yesterday. Okay?
Why is that horse so scary?
Well, okay, first off, I caught this horse on Friday, so I'm very offended by your comment that it's scary. Because this is Adler, and he's very cute. Adler.
Look at its eyes.
Aw. Well, it's a CGI, guys. Okay, well, I thought you guys, everybody else said aw, and you guys are being mean to my horse, so that's not very nice. Now, in Red Dead Redemption, which right now is my total game of choice, as I was starting to play this game, I realized that this game is actually really historically accurate. It has a lot of things in this game that has to do with this class. I'm not saying reference Red Dead Redemption on your essay, but reference the parts of it. So, for example, there were this idea of the outlaws and the people who were going to go and steal this. When these outlaws were caught, though, they wanted to make sure they made it very clear that you couldn't do this. So what they would do is the sheriffs, who were kind of corrupt themselves, but they would actually, when they killed these outlaws, they would put them on public display. So this guy on the left, he was actually wrongly accused. The guy in 1920 ended up actually confessing to the murder. They basically nailed him onto a board and put him in the public square, and people sat there and made fun of him for 3 weeks as he rotted. This guy over here was a bank robber. They put him in a chair in the middle of the town square after he had died, and people for the next 4 weeks stoned him, beat him up, did anything they could to punish him. Now, another thing about this is you might have played the game and heard of this thing called Pinkertons. They say it like every 15 minutes. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was a real agency. They were basically hired guns, like a mercenary. They were actually Abraham Lincoln's guards during the Civil War because he didn't trust the local government. Well, what happened is that the Pinkertons, who also you might have heard about with the Homestead Act, because they were there, or Homestead Strike, because they were there too. If you've ever heard of the idea of the private eye, that actually comes from the Pinkertons, because this was their logo that says "We never sleep." That's why it's called a private eye. Now, anyways, so that is your connection to modern day. That game actually really is historically accurate, although it is rated M for mature, so please ask your parents' permission before playing. Now, next class, we're going to talk about the impact of all of this on Native Americans. So you can put your stuff away, and we'll see you next class.
Okay.
Next class is going to be really sad. I'm just giving you a forewarning.